The subject matter of the film, I'm probably not going to show my face, but I just want to talk a little bit about the film Farming, which is by actor who's known as Adewale Akinwumi Ajabe. It's a little bit hard to pronounce, but I know you probably know him as Killer Croc from Suicide Squad. I finally saw it after much anticipation, and needless to say, it did not disappoint. This movie was really raw, very disturbing, and violent, and sort of indictment on race relations in 1970s, 1980s Britain that I think had to be said and had to be shown. I wasn't expecting to be, the kind of film it was that bold, but it was in the same vein as something like This Is England or American History X. I know I've heard so many of the headlines surrounding the film, albeit very few, because it's not getting as much attention, let's say, as like other films about race issues like Spike Lee's Black Klansman or there's a film coming out by a Catholic called Harriet Tubman. This one's not getting that much press, but it has to be seen. If you haven't seen it in Britain, you should, or it's on VOD in the United States. Very powerful film about the life of a young man, from a baby all the way to like a young adult or teenager, growing up, hating his own ethnicity and becoming the very thing that he dislikes, self-loathing neo-Nazi skinhead, in order to try to combat against the prejudice that was facing around that time. Some very powerful stuff there. It's definitely an interesting take on race relations, because mostly it shows it through the perspective of us versus them, but this is an instance where I know right-wingers and people on the alt-right are not going to like this video anyway, so I'm just going to say it. The oppressed becomes the oppressor as a means to combat against the impending threat. And that's what makes it quite interesting in this regards. It shows, through the perspective of someone who has seen himself toil down. Now he fights against it by becoming the very thing that he hates, and the amount of language and violence and intimidation that goes on in this film will likely disturb some viewers. But if you have a strong stomach, you should really handle it. It's an 18 certificate for good reason. I mean, it's the same as This Is England. That was an 18 film, albeit on the somewhat lower end of the spectrum, but you kind of get the idea there. It made me lose sleep. I almost thought I was going to cry on some of the instances, because there were some scenes that are very tough. The racism is already a given, but watching the scenes of the young boy being alone and trying to reconcile with his identity, which I can myself to some degree relate to, being to some degree British American, but also of multiracial background, is sometimes not an easy thing to do, trying to grapple the influences. But I would never go out of my way to join a neo-Nazi skinhead gang just to feel like I don't want to be targeted. Group mentalities, gangs, organized politics and religion is a dangerous foothold to climb over. That's why I just don't buy into it. But for some people, especially if they're poor, they don't necessarily have that luxury. You are at the mercy of the influences from the outside. And that's what makes this film quite tough. And I'm glad it was made. But man, this is going to give me quite a few nightmares. It's very much a talker. I personally thought it was a much more engaging film about race relations this year than there was a film that was come out called by Julius Honora about a Eritrean refugee child that's adopted by a white family called Luce. If you haven't seen it, it's alright. I mean, there's not much can be taken out of it. It doesn't have the same sort of suspense or grappling as this. This one grabs you by the nuts and punches you multiple times. That's how I feel about it. I hope more people hear about this film, because it's that good. Or for that matter, the other film I saw, The Day Shall Come, which had its moments, but it was more satirical, a little bit more lighthearted than this, and didn't have as much violence or as graphic imagery and language as Farming did. But to each his own, I suppose. This is definitely not Green Book. I can tell you that right now, or Hidden Figures. This is really raw, and it's always interesting to see this sort of issues from a British perspective. I know an earlier film called Blinded by the Light depicted race relations in the 80s between South Asian communities and white communities. This is depicted between black Nigerians and white communities in Tilbury, Essex. And Essex is an area I used to grow up in, near the Grays, Thurrock area. So there's a lot I can relate to. I just wish they would show a bit more of the locations in that area, as well as Southend and Thurrock. Otherwise, this movie would have been probably my number one. Probably beat Toy Story 4, in my case, or even Joker. And speaking of Joker, this film, They Shall Come, Cuck, are all movies that I can agree upon that are, very much topical films about when violence and paranoia and self-loathing chronicle together and create the monster. The society create the monster. I think that interests me, and loneliness, because the character's very lonely in this film. He doesn't even associate with anyone, let alone his foster family. It's the most interesting aspect about these films I've just seen, and it really grabs you by. I mean, I could go on about farming and Joker and Cuck and all the others, but I'm not going to. That could be for another time. I didn't want to show my face because the subject matter is quite disturbing. I can't relate to it entirely, but I can definitely relate to the aspect of being isolated and alienated, and sometimes issues of self-loathing, but not to the point of joining a gang. That's just taken too far. But to each his own. So feel free to keep on my views. Oh, I forgot what Jojo Rabbit is. Well, that's another movie that has similar elements to farming as well, but themes of prejudice and isolation. Yeah, I said it. So, feel free to keep subscribing to my reviews, and this is Skinny but signing off.